mic. Yeah. All I need is one mic. Yeah. All I need is one mic.
Hey everybody, welcome back to One Mic, where I watch shit so you don't have to. And today I'm here to talk about Season 1, Episode 6 of HBO's House of the Dragon, entitled The Princess and the Queen. Princess and the Queen here refer to Rhaenyra, our princess, and Alicent, our queen, and their rivalry, which kind of like is the focal point of this episode and does seem to spark a lot of the storylines that revolve around the surrounding characters as well. So it really is not just the focal point of this episode, but, you know, as I've kind of alluded to, I wouldn't even say alluded to, I've directly said it. I feel like everything that we've watched up to this point has been leading us up to this moment, and how everything between Rhaenyra and Alicent is going to spark the events of the rest of the series, let alone the rest of the season. But before I get started, I want to give a fair warning. I suspect that this video is going to be kind of long because there's so much shit that happened here that I think is worth discussing. You know, I said last week that, the first 30 minutes would be kind of like catching us up with what happened over the last 10 years, and then we move on from there, and I was wrong. The entire hour was catching us up on the 30 minutes. But what I loved about this episode, two things. One, I think it did a great job of catching us up on what happened over that last 10 years, but also kind of giving us an idea, kind of like setting the stage for how things are going to proceed going forward. But then also this episode again does what I said last episode did, and what I think the Game of Thrones properties do great as a whole. Well, I make it sound like there's like 7 of them, just these 2, but it's working in the subtext. And what I mean by that, so I can be clear, so when I say it, which I will inevitably be saying it a lot throughout the remainder of however long I end up covering the show, is that, you know, you have your surface level interpretation of what's being said. You know, the actual language that is being shared between two characters, and the very on the surface kind of explanation of what they're saying. But what this show does great, and Succession does it great as well, is it says way more with what's not being said and with reading in between the lines. And this show does a great job with that as well. And I think that's what makes a lot of what makes this episode so great, is that a lot of what really gets your brain moving, what gets you thinking, and what's going to stick with you over the course of this next week while we wait for the next episode is going to be all of the shit that the show doesn't say, and how all of those things make you wonder, okay, well, what happens in this scenario? What happens? And it just makes you think about what's really going on behind the scenes, what these characters aren't saying to one another, how the unspoken is going to spark all different kind of actions, theorizing like, okay, well, if one person takes it this way, then this can happen. If another person takes it this way, then this can happen. And like all of that, the way it just gets your brain working. Nothing like these Game of Thrones shows to really kind of like just stick with you throughout the week and in between these seasons as well. And I think this is another one of those episodes that really does a great job of that. But I think it's best to talk about this episode from a character perspective, because it'll kind of help us have a central focus on, okay, this is where we left these characters, you know, last week. Now we've moved ahead 10 years, and this is where they are now. So I want to tackle this from a character perspective. And, you know, last week's episode ended with Kristen Cole beating somebody to death because he's a jealous little man boy, whatever you want to call it, and Alicent preventing his suicide, what he wanted to do. So I think that's a good place to start, because we could pick up from Alicent preventing Kristen Cole's suicide, because for starters, someone mentioned in the comments last week, like, you know, I can't believe that this show is not gonna, you know, we don't know how Kristen Cole continues to live despite what he did at this wedding. And I replied to it like, well, I think you're not giving the show an opportunity to answer these questions yet. Like, this was the end of the episode. We might find out next week exactly how Kristen Cole doesn't get put to death, or whatever the case may be. And come to find out, yet again, I was wrong. We do not find out why. I mean, of course, we can put 2 and 2 together and presume that if the queen wants you around, you're sticking around. I think that's all we're really going to get to take away from it. But I did find it interesting that I was like, yo, you haven't given the show an opportunity to answer that question yet. And then the show gets an opportunity, and they're just like, yeah, we're not going to answer that question. But like I said, we can kind of presume that Alicent looks at him as someone who is loyal I don't want to say to a fault, because it clearly worked out well for him that she respected his loyalty. But I think, having a guy who's willing to put himself at risk for over the truth is someone who Alicent's going to want on her team. So if Alicent decides, like, I want this guy not only alive, but I want him to now be my personal Kingsguard, Queensguard, so be it. And that's what's going to happen. And that's what did happen. And they seem to have bonded over a mutual hatred for Rhaenyra. And I think after this episode, that kind of places Alicent and Kristen as the two most unlikable characters on the show. And that's saying a lot, featuring with a show that features a guy like Larys Strong, who we'll be talking about a little bit later. But the episode opens with Alicent calling for Rhaenyra's baby that she just gave birth to be brought to her chambers. And Rhaenyra decides to go along with this despite having just pushed the baby out of her vagina. Like, all right, let me go walk. And she has to go up steps and all this kind of shit. But I love how this is the first example right away at the very beginning of the episode of how good this show works with the subtext. Because we know that Alicent has concerns over a potential queen, Rhaenyra, putting her kids to the knife to help solidify her and her kids' claims. And we know that because Otto put that in her head before he left at the end of the last episode. So we already know how Alicent feels about Rhaenyra just based off of that. So for her to call for that kid right away, Rhaenyra's probably suspecting some sort of treacherous activity. Like, as soon as my kid is born, she gets called to the queen when I already know that the queen hates me and already probably sees my kids as potential threats to her kids. All of that, it felt like a power play. And but they don't say any of that. And then Rhaenyra gets there after having gone up these steps because she's like, I'll be damned if I'm gonna let this woman see my kid, my newborn kid, without me around. Once she gets up there, they have this conversation that, again, on the surface is like, oh my goodness, I didn't want you to come up here. You should be resting. And Rhaenyra's like, oh yes, I'm sure you didn't want me to come up here. And that is what I love about this show, because that conversation was such bullshit. Alicent was hoping that Rhaenyra wasn't gonna come, and Rhaenyra knows Alicent was probably up to some shady shit, and they both hate each other, but they're both lying to each other to their faces directly, both knowing that the other person is full of shit. And that's what I loved about this scene, was that you know that those two are both bullshitting each other. They both know that the other person is bullshitting, and they're putting on this bullshit conversation, and it just shows Alicent's fakeness and caring about Rhaenyra's fakeness and being nice. And I loved that scene. And I think that's a perfect example of what this show does with subtext. But we learned that this is Rhaenyra's third kid, this one that was just born. We learned that Laenor wants to name him Joffrey after, which is, this is me just kind of being nitpicky and fucking with the show, but it's interesting that naming the kid Joffrey makes sense because at the end of the very last episode, and this is the beginning of the following episode, we just saw his lover Joffrey killed by Kristen Cole. But in reality, he waited 10 years to name his third kid after this guy that was killed by Kristen Cole 10 years ago. And it's like, okay, that's a bit of a stretch, buddy. You're gonna name your third kid after 10 years. 10 years later, after the lover that Kristen Cole killed, when you had two already. But we will be talking about the kids later. I have the kids here as kind of like a character that I want to go over. But so, like I said, we learned this is Rhaenyra's third kid. Laenor wants to name him Joffrey. It seems that everyone knows that these are actually Harwin Strong's kids and not Laenor's kids. I presumed that they would be Kristen Cole's kids, and boy, was I wrong about that. Harwin Strong, and just in case you're struggling with the characters, especially considering that a whole lot of new ones were introduced in this episode, but we know Harwin Strong he's the commander of the City Watch. He's the son of the current Hand of the King, Lionel Strong, older brother to Larys messy-ass Clubfoot Strong, and I think he's known for, despite everyone having this last name, Harwin is the one that's actually known for being strong. He has some sort of nickname, throwing motherfuckers around strong. He has some sort of badass nickname or something like that. So But we learned that these kids, which are dark-haired kids, when the Targaryen kids are all silver-haired, we know that everyone knows quietly that these kids are Harwin Strongs, except Viserys, who refuses to see the obvious. And I also there's a good line I think that Alicent delivers to Laenor when she's like, sooner or later maybe you'll get one that looks like you. I thought that was a nice line, and I also thought it was a nice touch in this after this scene where Rhaenyra leaves the blood trail leaving from Alicent's chambers. And then, like I mentioned, Kristen Cole, a complete and total massive piece of shit with the maturity of like an 8-year-old. He calls Rhaenyra a cunt 10 years later. He still hates her because she had sex with him one time, and now he proposed marriage and said, "Hey, why don't you give up your whole life to be with me after we had sex one time?" And Rhaenyra said, "I'm gonna have to pass on that." And now 10 years later, she's still a cunt, and he's doing horrible things like pitting their kids up against each other so he can have a dick measuring contest with Harwin Strong and make a public showing of what everyone already knows about the kids. So, like, Kristen is such a fucking asshole. Like, what? Like, using kids and pitting them against one another just to make a point, and because you're such a small man on the inside that you have to like I said, have this dick measuring contest with Harwin Strong. It goes a long way to instantly making Kristen Cole unlikable, which is ironic because he was very likable in the first 5 episodes, and now I'm pretty sure we're supposed to hate him. And if we're not, well, you fucked up because I hate him. So, moving along, let's talk about the kids, because we also learn about this new kid situation, this new dynamic, who has whose kids and whatever. So let's just lay it all out there so that you guys can, if you didn't follow, you can learn it right now, and we'll see what happens with these kids. So, Alicent and Viserys have the 2 that we already know of, Aegon and Aemond. Aegon, due to being the firstborn son of the king, is considered to be the proper heir by a large portion of Westeros. He's also very clearly the leader of the kids, as he leads the bullying of his younger brother Aemond, who's very clearly, I think, going to do something terrible out of revenge and spite later. This is very clearly a kid who does not take bullying lying down. Like, he's giving me big serial killer vibes here. Like, he's holding in and building up all this rage at being bullied, and he's gonna take it out on someone in a terrible way. We also learned that Aegon likes to jerk off outside of windows, and I think there's also an interesting kind of idea of like, isn't that the same window that Tommen committed suicide out of? And it's just like, oh man, if only you would know that a descendant of yours, a descendant of his, yes, Tommen, no, that's technically not a descendant of his, but a future king is going to commit suicide out of the window that Aegon jerked off out of. They also have a daughter, Helena, who Rhaenyra later proposes marriage. So, excuse me, still kind of getting over that cold a little bit. A daughter, Helena, who Rhaenyra proposes be married to her oldest son, Jacaerys. So Rhaenyra has Jacaerys, along with 2 others, Lucerys and the newly born Joffrey, who I've already mentioned. They called him Jason Luke in this episode, which felt a little bit too modern to me, but I let it go. But Jason Luke was a little bit much. But of note, we find out at the end of the episode that at the very least, Jacaerys, I think Jacaerys believes Harwin Strong to be his father, but at the very, very minimum, we know that he's suspicious enough to ask. So that could end up playing a huge role, especially once they find out what happens to Harwin at the end here. So, and then speaking of which, at the end for this storyline anyway, Rhaenyra, her family, and Carl with a Q. So, because if you don't have subtitles on, you're just gonna hear Carl, but his name is spelled Carl with a Q. He's Laenor's little boyfriend. They're all gonna head to Dragonstone. Talking about Alicent briefly, she clearly plays favorites here with these kids. She assumes that the bullying of Aemond is at the hands of Rhaenyra's kids. Viserys suspects that Aegon has something to do with it, and we know that Aegon not only has something to do with it, he's the ringleader. So Alicent is clearly playing favorites with her kids, both internally on her own, but also openly and outwardly with Viserys to kind of like, position their kids together as in a good light, and position, more importantly, I think, position Rhaenyra's kids in a negative light. And then she also insults them very very humorously, like, what did she say? She called them, none of her plain-faced kids are gonna marry mine. Like, that's, like, on paper, that's not that insulting, but, like, her saying it, and by this point, we already know, like, okay, it's time to hate Alicent now. Like, she's a terrible person. Plain-faced comes off so much harsher now with that. So, but yeah, Alicent, terrible person, favors her kids, and is willing to do terrible things in order just to fuck with Rhaenyra at the very least. I don't know. I mean, like, who knows? Maybe she's even worse. And if Rhaenyra hadn't shown up, maybe Alicent does do something to that kid. But again, why does Alicent choose to do something to the third kid? She could have done something to the first two. Just like, why didn't Laenor want to push to name the first two Joffrey and only names the third one Joffrey? But maybe he tried and got pushed back. Who knows? So moving on to Daemon. Daemon and Laena are married. They're living in Pentos. I think another interesting plot line here as well. Daemon seems to have matured. He's a quiet reader. He's, like I said, he's living on Pentos with Laena and their children. It's supposedly temporary, like they were just kind of supposed to be there, but someone there offers them the opportunity to live there full time if Daemon helps them out with a new situation in the Stepstones involving the Triarchy having teamed up with Dorne. And I love Viserys' reaction to that, by the way. Like, it's very much like, why the fuck I keep gotta dealing with the fucking Stepstones? Like, like the fact that he was, like, it is funny, like, how does this keep coming up over and over again? And I think for me it was extra funny because when you read the book, and I've only read up to this point, so I don't get spoiled on anything that's gonna happen going forward, but the situations with, not necessarily the Stepstones, but like situations with Dorne specifically constantly coming up over and over again. There's been several wars with Dorne. Like, it is funny for him to just be like, I still got to deal with the fucking Stepstones. Like, come on, man. Like, I thought this was resolved. So I liked how upset Viserys was about that to me, because no one else said that. It's like, I wish I remember what exactly he said to, like, the way he even worded it was funny. But Daemon doesn't want to go back to Westeros. He wants to stay there. He wants to at least entertain the idea of living in Pentos. And Laena's like, I want my kid to be born on Driftmark. I want my kid to be raised in Driftmark. Like, she wants to go back to Driftmark. And Daemon, I think, seriously not wanting to go back and wanting to avoid all of the politics and all the bullshit that comes along with being there, I think shows a level of maturity in Daemon that he's gained over the course of these last 10 years. And I think that's important, because I think it's an interesting thing to question what Daemon is going to do now, given the events of the end of the episode. So before I get to that, I do want to mention one more quick thing with Daemon and Laena and whatnot. A couple of quick things. I love the racing/flying scene with Daemon and Laena. I thought that was a really cool scene. And then it's an interesting kind of parallel here, how Laena reaches the same point that Viserys' wife Emma reached in the first episode, where it's kind of like, okay, do we save the baby and let the mother die, or risk killing both? Daemon's faced with the same decision that Viserys was faced with in that first episode, but he doesn't get to make it because Laena decides to sell Dracarys, and that's the end of that. But I do want to move on to kind of how this episode wraps up, which is the whole situation with the Strongs, Harwin, Larys, Lionel, and this kind of is going to play into what I was just saying about Daemon, but I'm going to tie that together in a moment. So Larys now seems to be Alicent's personal snitch. They sit together and, like, literally and metaphorically spill tea together. I don't know if they're actually having tea, but I think, hey, it's they're probably spilling wine, but we could call it the same kind of slang. It probably means the same thing in Westeros back then as spilling tea means today. But Alicent essentially remarks on how she wishes that her dad was still the hand, and knowing just as Lionel does, that the situation with Harwin and Rhaenyra's kids is coming to a head because everyone knows about that and the whole fight between him and Kristen, Larys decides that he's like, you know what? I got your message. You say no more. I will take care of it. And he decides that he's going to burn his father and brother alive, presumably for Alicent because she asked for that, and she will now owe him a favor. And he did it. He did this whole favor for her, killing his father and brother, so that Otto can be brought back as Hand of the King, just as Alicent would like. But I like how he hires these people to do this, though, but he cuts their tongues out to make sure they can't talk about it. Nice touch, Larys. But presumably, well, not presumably, this was definitely done to bring Otto back and to put Larys even more so in Alicent's good graces. But what I want to pose is, like, what if this plan backfires? Because I don't really see a reason why Viserys would go, all right, I'll just bring Otto back. Because he sent Otto away for valid reasons. Conversely, we have calm down Daemon, who is avoiding beef, has settled down with a family, apparently does a lot of reading and studying. What if this is like a huge backfire and Viserys is like, you know what, Daemon, I'm going to call on my brother to be my hand now. 10 years has done you good. You've matured. You got a family. You're much more learned. Why don't I have you come in and replace Lionel Strong as my Hand of the King, which would be such a great misjudgment on Alicent and Larys's part, because they get a complete 180 from what they were expecting. They're expecting Otto to be brought in, who is going to be firmly team Alicent, and conversely, if it plays out like I'm guessing, I have no idea what's going to happen here, but if it plays, obviously Daemon is going to need to be more involved in this story. If it plays out where it ends up being Daemon, that's a complete opposite of what they want, because now the Hand of the King is someone who's aligned with Rhaenyra. So that will make things a lot more interesting as well. So is there anything else that I wanted to discuss here? Let's see. One thing that this isn't like a criticism or anything like that, but is something that I would kind of like to pose as something that I would like to see a little bit more of, and we do see it here, is I do want us to kind of get out of King's Landing a little bit more. It happens every now and then, like, oh, here we are in the Stepstones, or maybe let's go to Dragonstone, let's go to Flea Bottom, which technically isn't even getting out of King's Landing. Like, let's get out of the Red Keep. We see a little bit more of that here. We have the scene in Pentos. We have, I think there was a scene somewhere else too. Are we on Dragonstone at any point? I don't know. I think we do end up at Dragonstone at the very end. But what I want to see is it's just this show is played out just as I said. We get actual episodes worth of prologue that lead to the main point of the show, which is this Dance of Dragons. We're there. We've had the 5 episodes of prologue. Now that we are where we need to be for the rest of the show, and we've had the events that spark the Targaryen conflict, now I would like to see this show kind of blossom into something that hits other places too. Like, I want to see where other kingdoms fit into this. How do they feel about this? What actions are they going to take based on what sides they take? So, like, I want to know, what is Dorne going to do? Dorne's not even in. Dorne already, I ain't in it. You ain't conquering me. We unbowed, unbent, unbroken. You can't fuck with us. We ain't in it. But they're going to take sides. What does that look like? What does it look like if whatever side the Eyrie chooses? What does it make it look like? Whatever side, the Iron Islands chooses, whatever side the North chooses, and Winterfell. Like, I want to see how these different areas are impacted by this beef, what sides they choose, how they choose to respond to that. Like, are you going to have, like, say if Winterfell is team Rhaenyra for queen, how is Winterfell going to respond if team Alicent / Aegon does something that they don't like? Just that kind of stuff. I'd like to see it expand out to the rest of the realm. I'd like to see, like, we haven't seen the Wall. Like, I don't need oh God, why am I fan service? I don't need fan service. Like, I don't necessarily need to see stuff just to see it. But I would like to get out of the Red Keep, get out of King's Landing, and get a little bit more of these other places involved, introduce some other areas, some other characters, so that way we can have kind of what we had in Game of Thrones, where it's like, okay, here's some time. Here we are in King's Landing, and now here we are in Braavos, and now here we are in Meereen, and now here we are in Dorne. Like, I want to be able to do a little bit more of that here as well. But really exciting episode. I really enjoyed what I saw. I love all of the things that play here. Like, for instance, okay, is Lionel strong? Do we even know he's dead? Because, like, Lyris is like, oh, yeah, I killed my father and brother for you. But he don't know necessarily that they're dead. And the way that scene kind of read, it kind of read as if only Harwin was in danger. And then we don't actually see Lionel at any point looking like he's in danger. Maybe some smoke inhalation, but maybe he can hop out the window. Maybe he has an exit that Harwin doesn't have. And that would be another interesting twist on the Hand of the King situation. What if Otto's not, I mean, what if Lionel is not even dead? What if he's alive? Like, and they just assume he's dead. So that again, that doesn't work out, because then now you have the Hand of the King who's going to be looking like, somebody tried to kill me and they successfully killed my son. You know, that's at play too. So really great stuff. And that's what I love about this show, is how we are now all going to spend this next week wondering how this Hand of the King situation is going to play out, what's going to go on with Daemon, thinking about all of the different ways in which Alicent and Kristen versus Rhaenyra could play out. Like, there's so many cool things to discuss and think about, and that's what I think makes this show great. That's what has me excited for these final 4 episodes, and that's what has me excited to see what you guys thought about this episode in the comments. So let me know what you thought, and I will see you guys next week for episode 7. Peace.